This is when we see the full-blown atomic breath, the new version of the atomic breath. Yeah, this is what you're referring to earlier about the dorsal fins coming out. It's a new effect. Like, it's always been that Godzilla's dorsal fins light up, which within the context of the Godzilla franchise, the idea is that he is raising his internal temperature to exude extra radiation to produce the heat ray. And the idea, which you understand this as biologists especially, is we know that a lot of dinosaurs had dorsal fins to help regulate their temperature. Yeah, this actually is a way to regulate temperature. And the same idea, Godzilla uses that to regulate this radioactive energy, basically.
Oh, sweet. Yeah.
So I think the idea here, which I thought was really cool, is that as the fins light up, they extend away from his body. And if you think about that, that's increasing surface area to release more of that energy.
Yeah.
But then when he's ready to do the death ray, they all go back into his body, which if you think about it, again, if you're increasing surface area, they're being pushed away from the body, that's releasing energy. So when they come back in, that means they're concentrating the energy right as he needs it. So I thought that was very cool, like medically, physiologically, that he was doing that. And this is bar none the most powerful death ray he's ever had. I mean, he shoots those tanks and a freaking nuke goes off. And you're just like, oh my God, like I'll gas, everyone in the theater gas on both times that I watched it, not IMAX and IMAX, like the theater was gasping when they saw this atomic breath, because holy cow, what a special effect. Did you feel the same?
Yeah, I was awestruck during that scene.
It was beautiful. It was beautiful. And I'll take this moment to mention what I did earlier about Godzilla's movement. When Godzilla first shows up on land now, he walks very stiffly. Like he's very much so, lift one leg up, move it forward a little bit, move it down. Pick another leg up, move it forward, put it down. Very methodical, very slow. And when I listened to some reviews of the movie, they're like, oh, they should have worked harder on Godzilla's, walking, like he looks so stiff. But I am here to tell you from medical and physiologic perspective, this makes perfect sense. And I'll explain why. Godzilla physically has changed immensely since being a Godzillasaurus. His legs and his tail have immensely increased in size. Like he is much more bottom heavy than he was as a Godzillasaurus. And the other thing, which I'm going to put this in terms that I think everyone can relate to, for any of you who have gone through puberty and were once a teenager or actively a teenager, you may remember that when going through that time, you were kind of awkward with your movements, right? So you were growing and you were kind of awkward with your movement. Anyone going through middle school will experience this in the same way, especially for men, awkward using your voice, like your voice is squeaking. Yeah. And this is something that is not uniquely human. All animal species experience this. If you've ever had a new puppy or kitten when they're like less than a year old, as they're growing, they also have awkward movements, but they seem kind of uncoordinated. And the reason for that is that your body can outgrow your brain's ability to compensate fine motor skill.
Sure.
So when you're a teenager, or if you're a less than 6-month-old puppy or kitten, your body grows so rapidly, your brain can't catch up with fine motor controls. So it takes a long time. Basically, if you're a human, most of your teenage years, for your body to relearn to control things from your vocal cords to your arms, your legs, etc.
Yeah.
And Godzilla's not going to be an exception to that. So, he gets nuked and then he shows up a few months later on land. He's heavier, he's bulkier than he's ever been. So yeah, he's going to look awkward, just like we do. So I point that out because people are like, oh, that's a criticism. Like, no, that's realistic. He's grown immensely in size. How is he going to be able to control his body?
So you added more to what I was thinking, because I saw his body and I was interested. A big part of biology, the type of biology I do, discovering new animals or identifying animals, you look at bodies. You look at their morphology. A lot of modern biology is based on, maybe this is incorrect, but it is the way it is. It's based on the way you look, the size of things. So I look at bodies, a lot of animals. And I thought, to me, it made sense. I was like, yeah, he's huge. He needs to have a large base, like a pyramid, to support him. So I thought that's what it made sense. That made sense to me. But I of course, now I realize you're right. It's not only that, but it's the timing. he's just barely got into this body. So maybe in the future, he would be more nimble. But
Yes.
the way the timeline he's going through is awkward, learning his new motor skill stage. That's great. Great observation.
Exactly. And the other thing, it's not directly said, but I think it's heavily implied, is when he attacks the Ginza district of Tokyo, I think that's the first time he's been on land since he became Godzilla. So this is also like his first time of like walking on land and getting his land legs, if you will.
Right. Interesting. Cool. Yeah, well, that was a brilliant scene. So I think one little scene I liked in it, a whole thing, which was great, is there's some reporters on a roof. Is this the right scene where the reporters are on the roof?
Yep.
Okay, so there's a team of reporters. So there's a guy talking with a microphone. There's a camera guy. There's a guy with just a video camera. There's a guy with just a regular camera, and there might be one more guy there. And they're on the roof, and it's really, it's kind of a funny and thrilling scene. It's like a really good set piece in this bigger scene of destruction. But the reason it works so well is because you're listening to the commentary.
Mm-hmm.
You're listening to the live play-by-play. It's like, okay, Godzilla, these are what the reporters say. He just tore that building up. Okay, he's looking at us. Okay, he's getting really close to us. We're actually in a lot of danger. We might die. And it's just kind of funny. It's like morbidly funny. And it's just commenting on the movie as it's happening. And then, I don't know, just the way when Godzilla finally knocks over the roof of that building, the way the whole roof tilts over, it's like you're on a roller coaster ride. You feel like you're at the top of the roller coaster hill about to go down. And it's just done so well. That one little part was so good in the movie. Not to mention how well that iconic scene they were redoing of Godzilla picking up the train car, and the woman hanging from it, just the way the angles were done. Also very well done. Like you felt like you were there. And it's like a really roller coaster ride, which I enjoyed a lot.
It is. And the reporter scene is actually the second iconic scene they're recreating from the original. So that happened.
What a coincidence.
1954. Exactly. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. The only slight difference is that in this version, Godzilla kind of knocks their building down by accident. Like he's not really going after them, per se.
Right.
Even though he's right there. He purposefully does it in the original. Like he stares them down, roars at them, and just smashes the building. Now, ironically, the reason this is a very famous scene is it was actually a criticism of the media at that time in Japan. The idea of sensationalism media. Right. The idea that you would have these reporters who were just like ridiculously risking their lives when they didn't need to, just to get the story, basically.
Yeah, that's the comedy element. The comedy element that I was talking about. That's where it came from. The absurdity.
Yeah, exactly. So they recreated that because that sensationalism journalism, yellow journalism, if you will, was very prevalent back then. And it wasn't a uniquely Japanese thing, but the Japanese really hated it. They hated it a lot back then. But that still exists today, folks. So it's also a contemporary thing. If any of y'all saw the UFO movie Nope, they also made fun of it in Nope. The TMZ reporter who was on a motorcycle, and he gets heavily damaged trying to photograph the UFO. And his last words are, like, as he knows he's about to die, he's like, can you get this on camera?
Yeah.
So this is not a unique Japanese thing or anything. Like, we can relate to this today. Any of those, God rest her soul, who are big fans of Princess Diana, you know what I mean. Like the paparazzi, et cetera. Like that's what that scene is making fun of.
Right. Yeah. And it's still true today. But yeah. Okay. That's why that scene stood out to me. I was like, there's something about this scene is really drawing my attention. I mean, it's well done, but yeah, I did not realize that was recreating a iconic scene. Very cool. Very cool. Very cool.
Exactly. So all of that is there. And then, of course, you mentioned before, this is the famous thing where when Godzilla is doing his atomic breath and the huge shockwave is coming from his atomic breath, the main female lead pushes the male lead to safety, and then she takes the force of the blast with a bunch of other people, and we presume she's dead, and for good reason. And that's a very sad scene because you're like, you mentioned like this guy gets -1, -2, -3. This is another huge loss for him that he's like, now he lost this, love interest basically that he could never profess his love to. And you're just like, damn, like I feel for this guy. I really feel for this guy.
That scene was so well done. I mean, I didn't see it coming, like, because I didn't see any deaths coming. It can happen any time. So it did shock me when it happened. I was devastated. Like, I still see the image of her as she was being swept away. That one scene, I can still imagine it. And they held on it for just the right amount of time, I think, to leave an impression on me. And then they had some shots of him afterwards. Another type of specific scene I like is watching, mainly men, but I guess maybe women don't do it that often, but a scene of a man. This is what happens. So after she is presumably killed, the protagonist, he's just quietly losing his shit. It's just completely broken on camera. He's like grabbing his hair. I don't think you hear him, so the sound cuts off, I believe. But you see this. It's a really great acting moment, because the acting direction, you got to think what he was thinking is like, I need to visually show a man who's just lost everything, completely broken man, and it just happened right now. So that was done really well, and I like that scene. I think he does it at least once more. He does it a few times, but this is the main one, I think, when he loses everything.
Exactly. And there's a very small detail at the end of that scene where he's losing his shit, which for those in Japan or anyone who knows about nuclear fallout, it'll really hit him home, which is the black rain. So he's sitting screaming his lungs out at Godzilla, and then this black rain falls. So historical context, for those who don't know, when there is a nuclear blast that happens, it pushes a lot of dust, debris into the air, and sadly, human remains into the air. And all that gets turned into ash and falls back to the ground as black rain. And this was something that we didn't know about until the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But the survivors of that described that as being terrifying. This black rain pouring all over them. So it's like, hey, you survived atomic bombing, great. And now you got all this black rain, which is highly radioactive, oh, by the way, coming over you. And I love that they included that in there, because it's a very small thing, but it is something that happened. It is something that was terrifying when it occurred. And they relate to that immediately after, because they talk about the radiation of Godzilla and cordoning off parts of Tokyo, and they're trying to deal with the radiation fallout. So I'm glad they put that detail in there.
Thank you for mentioning that, because I'd forgotten. There's so much good stuff in the movie. I'd forgotten that, but now I remember. I saw the black rain and I was like, what's going on there? I was like, that looks really cool visually. It fits the devastation. But thank you for explaining that. I did not know that. I bet you the majority of people will not know that when they watch the movie.
As you said, that's why I'm here.
That's why you're here. Yes, sir. Before we leave that scene, I do just want to point out why it's a good scene here. The female protagonist, this demonstrates her true love for the main character, I believe. Yes, because she instinctively pushes him away, I think in that split moment, knowing that she was probably going to die. And so it's kind of an instinct thing that kicks in for her. Even though she's shell-shocked or whatever, the love is strong enough that she does that for him. Yeah.
Exactly, which is beautiful. And the last big thing of that scene, I mentioned like a beautiful picture on the wall of her in the rail car with Godzilla's reflection. The other beautiful scene, which I would easily put on my wall, is after all that's done, after the guy loses his shit in black rain, they show Godzilla staring at his devastation. They show him staring at the mushroom cloud he created with his atomic ray, and then he roars afterwards. Yeah. But you're like, damn, that is such a visually amazing scene. To see Godzilla staring at a mushroom cloud of his own creation. I was just like, wow, that is just amazing.
Yeah, and it was one of those scenes where it's like, I haven't seen this scene, but I should have. Like, it's an obvious, awesome scene to do with Godzilla. Like you said, having him just roaring at his own devastation, which is a mushroom cloud.
Yep.
So really well done. Yeah.
Never been done in the Godzilla movie. So it was beautiful.
Perfect. Well, yeah. So I guess that wraps up that scene. That's probably the biggest scene of the movie. Would you say? Yeah. Not emotionally. Well, yeah, actually emotionally too.
Yeah.
It's pretty emotional.
Also, the violence of Godzilla stomping on people. Like, this is one of the few movies where you actually see Godzilla brutally murder people with intent, stepping on people. That was a big deal too. So immediately after the scene, they do a brief funeral scene for the female protagonist, and they're gathered at the house. And this is where I think this dude has hit rock bottom at this point, because the daughter Akiko is there, and they're explaining to her like, "Mommy's not coming home," and Akiko's crying. And you just see this guy just, as you said, quietly losing his shit. I believe the female character is Noriko, if I remember correctly. So she's gone. We believe she's gone and dead. He's like, I gotta raise this daughter now. Godzilla's here. No one's gonna stop him. And I mean, he's just losing his shit. I mean, he is just losing it. And then the doctor character, gray-haired doctor, comes over and he's like, "Hey, look, shit's really bad right now, but we're trying to come up with a plan to stop Godzilla. Do you want in?" And you can see in his eyes, he's like, "You don't have to ask me twice."
Yeah.
He's like, "I want to get that son of a bitch after he killed Noriko."
And doesn't he say something kind of dark right before the doctor comes up? Like he's talking to maybe the souls of the people he believe are haunting him. And he makes one statement. I don't remember exactly what it is, but it's a very dark statement. And then it's almost like the doctor's comes in with his plan or his idea, and it pulls him out of that darkness.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So he's looking at photographs from the mechanics who died, of their families and so forth, that obviously they didn't get to come home to.
So let's explain that real fast, because this is a really well done prop, really just a small prop, probably didn't cost a lot of money, so emotionally effective. So I believe right when he escapes Odo Island, he's on a boat with a lot of other war veterans. Yeah. And a man comes up, a strange, kind of fatigued, war-weary man comes up and gives them what looks like paper wrapped in like dark brown paper, like parchment paper. And then you see, then the guy just goes away and you see the main character kind of shocked by what he's seeing. Yep. And this envelope, this parchment, you find out are photographs. They play a big role throughout most of the movie. So let me ask you, who was that guy? Was he just a random survivor that handed him the envelope? He wasn't anybody that we saw before, was he?
No, he wasn't someone we saw before. So I think he was like a mail person, for lack of a better term, because what he delivered were letters, is what he gave to him. Oh, I guess he's like, "Look, you're one of the few survivors of Odo Island other than the other mechanic guy. So, you get to have this stuff because no one else is alive to get it," basically.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. Very good. Okay. So now going back to the scene we were talking about, he is at his lowest point and he's looking at the photographs, which turned out were photographs of the families of the mechanics who died, which he thinks was his fault. He thinks it was his fault they died, but it probably wasn't, because I think Godzilla would have killed him anyway. What if he really did mess up there? What if that gun, because remember the guy, the main mechanic tells him, "This size gun," I'm not a gun guy, "this caliber gun will kill anything." What if he could have killed Godzilla then and prevented everything else from happening? Is that a possibility?
I think it is. And I think the movie leaves it ambiguous for that reason. That obviously becomes a driving factor of him wanting to get revenge on Godzilla, both his own personal shame of not having done it on Odo Island, and then after Noriko dies.
But he's looking at the photos. He's at his lowest points. And then what is, do you remember? I don't remember. What does he say that's kind of dark?
Yeah, he's like, I think he's like, "You won't forgive me," basically. Yeah. Like, "You won't forgive me for this." Like, again, he feels like he's being judged for living. He's being judged for having survived all this when so many others haven't, basically. And you see him just creeping to that darkness, like maybe even contemplating suicide. And then here comes the doctor who pulls him out, basically gives him a reason to keep going. Then we get into what is always interesting in Godzilla movies, which is, how are we going to stop Godzilla? What's the plan? What are we going to come up with this time? Yeah. Which is a classic, this happens in every Godzilla movie. So for those who have seen any, like, you knew this was coming. When are we going to talk about how we're going to deal with it? But what's unique about this one versus basically every other Godzilla movie is every other Godzilla movie, it's a government meeting. The government's coming together and they're like, what are we going to do? Bring in the military generals, bring in the scientists. What are we going to do? But here, again, the government is effectively neutered. Like there's very little government to be had at this point. So instead, we're basically getting ex-military officials, mostly ex-Navy officials. They mentioned a captain of a Japanese warship is leading them. and basically saying, hey, we got to take care of Godzilla because no one else is going to, basically, is what they lay out. And they explain again, the U.S. military is not going to help us. The Japanese government's not going to help us. They say it very plainly, like it is up to us private citizens to get it done, which again, as a direct metaphor to the pandemic, is how a lot of Japanese felt, that it's on us to get through this.
And as a wider message, it's a very good message, regardless of the historical context of what happened a few years ago, regardless of World War II. It's like, ultimately, we can't rely on these larger organizations. They're great. They're great to have these governments, but sometimes you just gotta help each other out locally.
Yes.
With your neighbors.
Exactly. As John F. Kennedy once famously said, don't ask what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Sometimes you have to have that mentality, and truly your country, not, oh, I got to do this for my government that doesn't seem to care about me, which is the message in this film. It's like, no, you're doing this for your countrymen. You're doing this for your country, regardless of the government, regardless of bureaucracies. So they start talking about the plan. So they're like, and this is where, again, they explained the fish bladders and all that earlier, is they say, okay, look, Godzilla, he's in the ocean, and their idea is that what if we could sink Godzilla so rapidly down to the bottom of the ocean that the compression kills him, which in real life, if you're talking about like a humpback whale or a sperm whale that can deep dive, or a shark that can deep dive, that could happen. If they go down too quickly, they're going to die because their body doesn't have time to adapt, doesn't have time to adjust. And the means by which they want to do this is very sound too. They talk about using Freon gas, which doesn't have to be Freon gas. It could be any significant gas they use. The idea is just using the physics of density and buoyancy. The idea is that if you fill the water around Godzilla with gas, that means that becomes less dense compared to Godzilla. If Godzilla becomes more dense compared to it, he has to sink because he loses buoyancy.
But it's a good plan. That's a good plan.
Yeah, it's a solid plan. Just the basic idea is if you have two objects with different densities, the higher density object is going to sink in comparison to a lower density surrounding. And humans, like the majority of our bodies made of water, presumably Godzilla is the same as most animals. The majority of our bodies are made of water. So we are more dense than water because we have non-water things in us. But we're not so different in the density of water that, again, if you were out in the ocean, especially salt water, which salt water, because it has salt, is more dense than regular water, it's going to allow you to be buoyant to some degree, where you may not have to dog paddle or do much to keep your head above because of buoyancy. Godzilla does the exact same thing. But again, you change that density of the water around you to make it less dense, then all of a sudden that buoyancy is gone and you're going to sink like a rock.
And they have a plan B, which is good. It's always good to have a plan B. And they technically have a plan C even, which we'll get into. But their plan B is like, okay, let's do this. There's a balloon company that works in Japan. So not only are we going to sink him really fast, because that'll hurt him because of the pressure change, once he gets to the bottom, which is purposely going to get him to go out, the deepest part of the ocean or the sea around Japan, so he get the maximum pressure change.
Yeah.
Not only are we going to get him down there quickly, which will damage him, let's get him back up really quickly, which will also damage him.
Yeah.
So either it doesn't really matter which direction you're going, it's just the speed that you're changing the pressure. So as a backup, they're going to also wrap around him a bunch of balloons that will inflate and just take him above ground super quickly, which should do the same thing. So that's their plan B.
Exactly. The idea is that they're either killing through pressurization, going down to the seafloor, or depressurization, coming back up. Because what you need to do one is the opposite of the other. So they're banking that Godzilla will not be adaptable enough to survive a descent followed by an ascent, if needed.
Godzilla is eventually defeated for the time being. This plan A and plan B did not work alone. But do you think they helped plan C work? Do you think they weakened Godzilla? Yeah, so they did weaken him significantly, I believe. Yeah. And we're definitely getting to plan C. And that's also, I've heard some criticism of like, why didn't they just do plan C to begin with? I'm like, I don't think plan C would have worked by itself. Good point.
I don't think it would have. Yeah. Because that's a criticism I've heard. And again, we'll get to what Plan C is later. But no, I think they needed Plan A, B, and C collectively to get this done. And I like this about it. Like there's a lot of criticism during that scene in the sense that the characters participating are actively questioning the plan. You know, one of the extras asked a question like, "Well, Godzilla's of the sea. Can you really kill him with the sea? I mean, how do you know this is going to work?" And I like it because that's what us, the audience, are thinking, right? Like, even if you understand the physics, you're like, I mean, well, Godzilla's a deep sea creature. They've established that. So like. And he's very regenerative. Even if he doesn't do well with the pressure change, you know, are we going to be able to overcome that? And I like that because a lot of these movies, doesn't have to be even a kaiju movie. It could be a monster movie about, you know, Jason Voorhees or Michael Myers or whoever. And they're like, is this plan going to work? And usually they just accept it on face value. Like, yes, this is going to work. But I like the idea. I felt this was more realistic, that if I was in that audience, I would be asking those questions. But I thought that was very cool that they did that.
And to give the scientist credit, he's like, I can't guarantee it's going to work, which is the truth. Exactly.
Very cool plan. And then this also hits again on a lot of the post-war trauma from World War II. And again, get to the nitty-gritty. Like, we've explained the plan, who's with us, right? Like, who is actually going to help us with this? And again, a lot of the people are like, look, we're war veterans. Like, we've seen people throwing their lives away, you know, for plans that didn't work. Why should we do this again? And the ex-Navy captain who's leading the operation, he's like, look, let me put it plainly to you. He goes, none of you have to do this. You know, if you were in the war, you were forced to do these things. You know, you were forced to sacrifice your life, whether you wanted to or not, or you felt it was a good cause or not. But he goes, we're not forcing anyone to do anything. You know, we want volunteers. We want you to fight for your country. And as one would expect within a group of people, some people do leave. Some people are like, we got families, you know, I'm not going to throw my life away, yada, yada. But the majority who end up staying is this notion of like, you know, they've witnessed at this point what Godzilla's power is and what he did to Tokyo, the Ginza district of Tokyo. So it's like, how on earth are we going to, if we don't do this, who's going to, basically? And basically having that kind of can-do attitude, if you will.
Yeah.
And the notion that we can basically now put our lives in line for a worthy cause, where a lot of them felt by the end of World War II, their lives are on the line for something that wasn't worth it in the end.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was a great scene. There's a lot of scenes of compassion in the movie. The doctor gives a really good speech.
Yes.
When they're getting ready to execute the plan, they're at a planning table. He's got a map out and he's getting ready to execute the plan. And I think he's being questioned about the risks of the plan. He's being questioned, is this a certain death plan? Basically, is this a kamikaze plan for all of us? And he gives a really good speech about, you know, what was wrong about the war.
Yeah.
And how it's different now at this moment. They're still at war with a different enemy, Godzilla, but he's like, it's different now. Yeah. I don't know if you want to talk about that scene.
Yeah, and that was speaking directly to a lot of specific Japanese post-trauma, but it can expand to war in general. So the specific phrase they use when they're putting together the final plan and execute it for Godzilla is they use the phrase, "We in Japan have taken life too cheaply." Yeah. What they mean by that, when you look at the Japanese war from a Japanese perspective specifically, is that Japan threw its people into the meat grinder. And they did not have the greatest supply lines to supply their troops. They had far inferior tanks compared to America or the Soviet Union. And then obviously the kamikaze pilots. And a little bit of background on the kamikaze pilots, a little bit of background on piloting in general. At the beginning of the war, like Pearl Harbor and like the first year of World War II of U.S. involvement after Pearl Harbor, Japan was on point with us with regards to like having really experienced pilots. The Zero airplane, which was the main airplane they used, was a very top-notch aircraft. It was better than what we initially had in America as a fighter plane against them. So they were really on par with us at the beginning of the war. But as the war went on, things shifted dramatically for two main reasons. Number one, the Japanese Navy and Air Force did not really value the life of their pilots like Americans did. And what do I mean by that? Well, in America, we had this knowledge to be like, look, we're pumping up our manufacturing capabilities. We can make as many planes as we need, but we need to have good pilots to have those planes be effective. So America was very big on, we didn't invent the ejector seat, but we made very big use of the ejector seats in our aircraft. And even if a plane crashed and couldn't use an ejector seat, but the pilot lived, we went to great lengths to get our pilots back. Because the idea is that if an experienced pilot can live and the plane is destroyed, just get him another plane. And then you got an experienced pilot out on the field again. The Japanese didn't take that same perspective. They didn't invest in the ejector seats. They didn't invest as heavily in finding new pilots. So oftentimes, when that experienced pilot's plane go down, the pilot died too. So as the war drug on, you had these experienced Japanese pilots who basically all died over time, going against experienced American pilots who were losing planes but still living. Don't get me wrong, of course, there were many experienced American airmen who lost their lives, may they rest in peace, along with the Japanese as well. But the fact is that allowed the United States to beat Japan over time because we kept our experienced soldiers going and they lost all of theirs. And that's where the kamikaze came in to be like, look, we don't have experienced fighters, yet we need something to be able to overcome the Americans. So thus kamikaze, like you don't need to be experienced to be a kamikaze pilot. And that's why that became this last ditch effort at the end of the war. So that's what they're referring to when they talk about life is viewed too cheaply, because they really didn't care so much about the individual Japanese soldier, because they felt, we have enough blood and treasure to get through this, and we'll break the American will and win, which obviously did not work. Now, for the outside American perspective, there's irony in this statement. Or I should say outside Japanese perspective, there's irony in this statement, because we also know the Japanese military did not look well upon life that was not Japanese either. Namely, how did they treat American POWs with the death marches? How did they treat the Chinese when they invaded the Chinese mainland, like the rape of Nancy? See, there is great historical context in which the Japanese did not view anyone's life with great dignity. But the Japanese, as a society, have been very slow to acknowledge the war crimes that their government committed. And to be fair, so has the American government. So we talk about Japanese internment camps and so forth, but that's not really the purpose of this podcast. So I won't go too deep into that. But I just say that I really hit home when he said that, because I was like, yes, this is something the Japanese have really struggled with, is to accept that their government did not take the best care of their soldiers. And thus the kamikaze and so forth happened. But they stopped from saying our government also committed war crimes, which is something that even in 2023, the Japanese culture is still struggling to accept they did it. Very different than the German population, which has very much accepted what happened with the Holocaust and the rise of Nazi Germany. Baby steps, we're taking. But I was happy to see them criticize the Japanese military in World War II in a Godzilla movie, because that's a huge step forward culturally for them to talk about that.
I was going to say, when I heard that, I was like, what? I've never heard this before. And I've always been curious. I'm like, what is the Japanese comment? I mean, I haven't sought it out, but I haven't seen it in popular culture. And I got it with this movie. I've always wondered what is at least some group of Japanese culture's opinion on their own actions during the war. I'm American. We've had a lot of wars, recent wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, and I've heard a lot of commentary about what other Americans think about those wars through films and media. And it was interesting hearing that finally from Japan in a movie.
Yeah, and what's interesting is I think in that time frame that wasn't really talked about at all. Like, I think there is much indoctrination through the media and through the government that the Japanese just didn't talk about that back then. But again, this is a change in history. Godzilla changes things, and that's his job. That's again the social narrative that Godzilla takes the lid off of these things and allows these conversations to be had. So while sure, you take Godzilla out and look at real history, I don't think a lot of Japanese were talking heavily about that at the dinner table. But, when Godzilla shows up on their doorstep and the government's not doing much to help them, they're like, this kind of feels like World War II again, but they didn't really help us back then. So again, that's the beauty of Godzilla, is it's allowing them to have this conversation, both within that time frame of the 1940s, but also contemporarily to look back and say, should we have done this? Similarly to how Godzilla, from an American audience perspective, helps us look back and be like, should we have dropped the A-bombs? Which I won't delve into my personal opinions or anything about that, because that's not the purpose of the podcast. But I think it's an important question that the entire Godzilla franchise asks is, should we have dropped the A-bombs on Japan? And I'm not saying that Godzilla is here to tell us it was wrong. I think it's good that we ask that question. But I think the American assumption that we had to have dropped the A-bombs to have successfully ended World War II is a true American assumption. Because I can tell you the Japanese don't believe that. If you were to go to their museum in Hiroshima dedicated to the A-bomb, they certainly don't believe it. And so I think it's important from an American perspective to ask that question. And this movie allows the Japanese to ask that important question of, which is, did the government do the right thing for us in World War II? Did the military treat our soldiers properly in World War II?
Super interesting commentary. I don't want to make light of this heavy topic, but I heard this joke. Someone else said it, but it's funny because it's true. But it's like, this is a great sequel to Oppenheimer. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, because it shows you the impact, right? It really shows you the impact. And for those who've seen Oppenheimer, the famous scene where he's meeting with the president, and he's talking about blood on his hands. Well, what you see in post-war Japan is the blood on the hands. This is what he is fearing. What has been done to the Japanese people.
So that was a powerful scene. We were just referencing the scene where the scientist says that the military, the Japanese government, they treated life too cheaply during the war, but that was not going to happen now with the battle against Godzilla.
Yeah. They specifically say, we're not here to fight to the death. We're here to fight to live in the future.
Right.
Which is very different mentality.
And it's funny, during that scene, by this point, we've learned that the main protagonist has a plan C, which involves him becoming a kamikaze pilot. So he's going to strap his ship with bombs. He got rid of the extra fuel, anything extra that he would need maybe to survive, got rid of that and put a bomb in there instead. And his plan is to go and crash directly into Godzilla's mouth, because he blew a bomb in Godzilla's mouth earlier and it really messed Godzilla up for a little bit. So he's thinking, we got to get him from the inside. So he's got a kamikaze plan, because he's at like -3, like we talked about. He's a very low point. And I thought it was funny that the scene we were just talking about, how the scientist said that his plan in the battle against Godzilla they're about to have, they're fighting to live. And I feel like that was almost directed, because he was there. The protagonist was there. He was already suicidal. And I feel like it was directed at him. Like in the movie's universe, I feel like part of that scientist speech was directed at him. Because he even says he's nervous about him. He's like, he's an ex-kamikaze pilot. We have him flying a plane around Godzilla. Like, I'm a little worried about the situation. I'm not comfortable with it. And as a viewer, like, yeah, we see it. We see him listen to that part, and he walks away while everybody stays. But I thought that little thing was well done too. That little aspect of he's hearing a message totally contradicting what he is thinking.
Exactly. And he had some scenes where he started with that too. So like the aircraft that he is given for this operation to basically lure Godzilla into the zone where they're going to attach the canisters and sink him is an experimental aircraft, but it's also been mothballed after the war. So it's in poor maintenance shape. So this is where we bring back the mechanic from Odo Island. They're like, we need a mechanic to fix this. And this is an experimental plane, so like an average mechanic will not do. Like, we need someone who served during the war and really knows these planes well. So that's what leads the main character to track down the mechanic who survived Odo Island. And very interestingly, we know they left on bad terms because the mechanic from Odo Island blames him for the death of all the other mechanics. So we see him go to great lengths to try and track down this mechanic, and he basically gets some ideas of several locations where he might live. So he writes a bunch of letters to him. And we can see that you can tell through how he's talking about this mechanic to others that he really wants to talk to him, but you get this feeling there's this double meaning. Like, yes, he wants to talk to him to fix this plane, but also I think he wants to make amends. Like, I feel like even before they do end up meeting, you feel that need that he wants to do that, right?
The way he gets his attention, you find out, you see him write all these letters, and you're like, oh, okay. He's writing all these letters to the last known addresses of the mechanic that survived Odo Island, the mechanic that blames the protagonist for the deaths of the mechanics. You see the protagonist writing him a lot of letters. You know, you assume he's like, hey, I need your help. Please come fix this plane. Come meet me here. But finally, when the mechanic shows up, he comes behind the protagonist. He knocks him out, which could have killed him, by the way. Knocked him out with like something. He ties him up, hog ties him. Mm-hmm. And when the protagonist wakes up after probably with a concussion, tied up on the floor, he's so happy to see the mechanic. Mechanic throws all these letters at him, and he's like, how dare you? How do you have the nerve to write me these letters and blame me for all the deaths on the island? You said it's my fault. How could you do this? And you find out that the protagonist is very clever, and he just admits, he's like, look, that's a lie. I apologize. I shouldn't have done that. That's disrespectful, but I don't believe you were the cause of these deaths. I just did that because I correctly guessed it would make you angry, and that's the only way you would come find me. And yeah.
Yeah, it's very clever because, again, if you think from a plot standpoint, they left on bad terms. So if he just writes a letter to him saying, hey, come help me fix this plane, we got to go fight Godzilla, why would he come? So that could have easily been an oversight in the plot, but it wasn't. Like, they thought through this.
Yeah. I thought it was clever. I think, I don't know, little things like that. It's like it teaches you about real life, like it's just a clever way of him to get the attention of someone. But it does come with risks. I mean, he was literally, you see a really well done makeup scene afterwards where his eye is just, it is fucked up where he got punched. Yeah.
Exactly. And then he, in order to ensure that no one thinks the mechanic is a bad guy, he just makes up a story like, oh, I was drunk and I fell, Yeah. And that's why I got the black eye, because he doesn't want anyone to know the tension between them. So he's also saving face for the mechanic to be like, yeah, he punched me in the eye, all this stuff, but I don't want anyone to know that because, again, we're here to deal with Godzilla. We can't let this stuff get in our way.
So they find this plane that you mentioned, which is supposed to be like a super amazing plane. It does look very cool. It does get repaired by the mechanic. And I just wanted to ask, is there anything special about this plane other than is there any significance that you caught other than it looks cool? It is a good plane. Anything else? I was just curious. Did you catch anything?
Nothing struck me. I mean, it's an odd design because it has a propeller in the rear, but I will be the first to tell you I'm not an expert on aircraft, so I don't know if this plane actually existed. I do believe you should be able to have a propeller on the opposite end of the plane as long as it basically turns in the opposite direction. Again, just basic physics I understand about how airplanes work, but I don't know if that plane actually existed. But the point of it for the plot is that because the plane is designed the way it is, it's super nimble, it's very maneuverable, which they need that to deal with Godzilla, especially if there's a need to avoid his death ray.
So they need to get Godzilla to the deepest part of the ocean, so they could wrap him up using 2 boats and some wires, wrap him up in gas and wrap him up in these balloons, and they have to lure him there. So the first plan is they have these speakers, and they're going to play back the recorded sound of Godzilla roaring, because Godzilla will think it's another Godzilla and feel threatened and want to be dominant, and will be drawn to that area to attack this perceived threat. Which I got to say, yes, it could work. It does. I don't think it works. It doesn't work in the movie. It could work with certain animals, but just in my guts, looking at how Godzilla acts, I don't think it would work with him. I mean, I'm just saying, if I was in the movie's universe, I would still try it. I guess it's better than nothing, but in my heart, I don't think it could work with another animal, like a rhinoceros, maybe even like a tiger. I'm saying the intelligence level has got to be a little bit lower for me, I think, for that kind of plan to work for an organism. Like a bear, a moose, it would work for a moose, I think. I just didn't think it would work for Godzilla. So if they can't lure him here or there, the plan is ruined. That's where this nimble plane comes in. That's where the protagonist comes in, because he's going to actually annoy Godzilla so much and risk his life that he's the bait to get Godzilla where they need to go.
He's asked the mechanic, as you mentioned before, to rig the plane with extra bombs, etc. But what's important is that he hasn't shared this with the other people planning the operation. Like, they don't know that the plane is going to be rigged to blow up. That is something they're kind of keeping to themselves. And that does lead to a scene where the night before all this is going down, one of the captain of the wooden boat from the very beginning of the movie, who is helping with the operation, he basically accuses the main character, like, you have a death wish, right? And he gets mad at him because he's like, you need to live for Akiko. You need to live for this little girl. She's already lost her mom. She lost her original parents. Like, she doesn't need to lose you. And you could see him struggling with that. Like, you can see him struggling with his need for revenge for Godzilla and his love for Akiko. And we see that in the final stages, like before they go and do this operation, he sits down and talks to Akiko, and Akiko draws this very, very cool child drawing of their family. And he makes this statement, which is where you begin to believe maybe he won't commit suicide trying to take down Godzilla. He goes, I feel like I want to live for something, basically.
Yeah.
So you start seeing this shift in mentality. And he talks about, I want there to be a future for Akiko as well, which I think is a really cool thing. And I'll mention that there is a visual that happens when they finally have the plane ready, and they're kind of, the mechanic is walking through the plane's capabilities with the pilot, with the main character who's piloting it. That there's something that happens there that, to me, foreshadows what is going to happen against Godzilla. But I'll just mention that there's a visual, but I'll explain it later, once we explain how to actually beat Godzilla.
Okay. There's a really good scene that's done, and it's probably right at the kind of the same point, where the mechanic is happy with this suicide plan. He's like, yeah, this is good. You do need to do this. You need to make this sacrifice. And so he's like, I'm more than willing to help you with these bombs. And he's showing him the whole thing. And there's this one moment where what's happening is the mechanic is explaining things to the protagonist, but the mechanic is listening, and he's really carefully to what the responses are. Has he grown as a person? Has he learned from some of his mistakes? Or is his mentality different? And it's not explicit, but I think that's what was happening, because there's one line where finally the mechanic, I forget what the protagonist says, but he says something like, I need to make things right, or I'm not scared, or I'm not going to be scared. He basically makes a statement that shows that he's changed the way he should change. And the mechanic hears that and he confirms it. He says something like, okay, now you're ready, or okay, now I know that you are done, or you're where you need to be, something like that.
Yeah.
And then we cut away, and we don't come back to the scene until the very end.
Yeah.
But I think something happens right after that, because the protagonist has changed. It tells the mechanic, hey, I can tell you something.
Yeah.
Which I guess I'll just say now, because we are in spoilers, but I think that's where he's like, listen, you don't have to kill yourself.
Yeah.
I installed a ejector seat here for you, and I think you should use it. And it's okay with me if you use it. I want you to use it.
Exactly. And what's funny is there's a visual right before that implies that there's an ejector seat. Because that's the funny thing, like you said, is they don't actually reveal that scene of him saying there's an ejector seat until after Godzilla's defeated.
Yep.
But leading into that scene, just as you described, where the main character is in the plane and they're going for everything, and the mechanic is testing him before he gets into the plane, it shows you a visual of the seat that he's going to sit in, and there's a white band over the seat that's written in German, and I don't read German, so I don't know what it says in German. But that tips me off because I was like, the Germans were one of the leaders and you're making ejector seats during the war. So I was like, I wonder if that's an ejector seat.
Mm-hmm.
And that was just a visual before all that happened. So that set me off to think, oh, like he won't have to kill himself to do this. So for those of you, if anyone knows German, I'd be interested to see if that actually says ejector seat or not. But that's what tipped me off to that possibility even before that scene.
Cool. Very cool. Yeah, like I said, they're good. They just go to the extra mile. They didn't have to do that kind of stuff.
Nope.
But they just, the passion, like you said, they cared about it. They're like, let's just get everything right. Let's go ahead and just make the best Godzilla movie. Why don't we just do that?
Exactly.
So yeah, that was great. And, you know, I pretty much guessed it was going to be an ejector seat after that scene, just the way it played out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I wasn't sure. And I was still surprised.
Yep.
But I was pretty sure. I wasn't 100% sure, but it was so cool. But yeah, so I think that covers everything, I think, leading up to the final confrontation with Godzilla. Unless you think of something else, or do you want to get into that scene?
No, the last bit, which again is kind of touting the line where they're planting a lot of this doubt of like, is he going to kill himself or not? Is he leaves a note, a letter next to Akiko before he goes forward with the plan, which as they're doing battle with Godzilla, Akiko brings that to the auntie character, the neighbor who's helped take care of her. And it's basically a letter to that auntie character saying, you know, take care of Akiko and here's all this money and spend it on her. So you're like, oh shit, you know, you see that, you're like, oh shit, he is going to die.
Yeah.
But I think we better understand when there is the ejector seat that was a contingency plan. It wasn't that he knew he was going to die, but it's possible even with the ejector seat, he may have died fighting Godzilla. So it wasn't that he planned to die, but he needed to have that plan in place in case he did.
When he starts taunting Godzilla, there's a lot of really cool scenes.
Yes.
Of just a camera, really close calls. The camera's right in the air and you see the plane just barely slip from the teeth of Godzilla's bite. Barely slipping between his fingers on his hand. That's really well done. I like that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. And you get to see that while Godzilla may not be so nimble on his feet on the ground, he's still very flexible to be jumping and, you know, throwing his head around and throwing his tail around, etc.
Absolutely. So then they do get him out to the correct area. And then this part was interesting. They have a dummy warship.
Yep.
Yeah. So that wasn't discussed in the plan, was it? That's just like a surprise to even us, I think.
Exactly. Yeah. They had four ships, I think, total. And one of them, is basically unmanned, but they have it rigged so that it can keep going in a straight line. And what we don't realize up until it gets destroyed is that they're doing this to lure out Godzilla's death ray, so that he death rays that ship, and then that leaves him more vulnerable.
And also, it's explained by the doctor that Godzilla needs a refresher, or needs a cool down time between the death ray or the heat ray.
Exactly. And they visually actually showed this earlier in the film. When he first uses the death ray on the battleship, or not the battleship, sorry, the heavy cruiser, when he gets out of the water, he is physically scarred. And again, when he does it in Ginza, he's also physically scarred. So they visually imply that Godzilla is damaged when he uses the heat ray and he has to regenerate. But then he verbally confirms it in that scene.
Cool. Very cool. Okay. Yeah, I did notice that damage he was taken. Very cool. So they distract him. So he blasts his ray at an empty ship that buys the Japanese soldiers or the regular people helping some time to ensnare Godzilla in these wires, which have the gas and the balloons attached to them, which is part of the plan.
Exactly.
So the first part of the plan, pretty flawlessly, no casualties, I think, up to this point.
Right.
And he is sunk down all the way to the bottom.
Yep.
And you do see him get damaged.
Yep.
He doesn't like it. It's definitely uncomfortable for him.
Yeah. Let's just say he feels the pressure.
Yeah. And but then the plan goes wrong. So he doesn't get killed. And what happens then is it then that they just start bringing, they're like, okay, let's just bring him back up with the balloons, right?
Yep.
And he gets stuck, let's say halfway through, right? So the plan is in peril. And it's the reason is because he I think he just bit or just broke the balloons, basically.
Yes.
And so they need to get him back up, and they don't have enough power to do it without the balloons. They only have these 2 ships, and that's when you see some of the community has come to help him.
Yep.
Yeah. Which reminded me a lot of Dunkirk, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Definitely. That's what it comes down to. An ordinary citizen stepping in to help in extraordinary circumstance.
Right. And earlier we had just seen a scene where the young guy, he was gung-ho. He had been damaged actually by his first encounter with Godzilla. His arm was in a sling.
Yeah.
And this young guy on the boat that worked with the protagonist, he was just told, hey, you're not going to help us. You got your whole life ahead of us. And then to themselves, his boss, the captain, and the scientists were like, out of the earshot, the other guy's yelling, the young guy's like, please let me help you. I want to help my country. They say something like, we're leaving a better country for him, or
Yeah, we leave the future to you. Yeah.
We leave the future to him. Yeah.
Exactly. Which is interesting. And we understand it, I think, from their perspective. They just went through this horrible war. Japan, just like the United States, Germany, everyone who, basically all the major powers that were in World War II had conscription. So while there are some people who did volunteer to get into the army, most people were conscripted, drafted into it. And this scene, I think, is very poignant because, yes, this young kid, leads all these other fishermen with these tugboats to come help them. And I think what's the important notice here is that there's a difference between the war veterans who are sacrificing their lives or putting their lives on the line, let's say, because they've already been through war. So they figure, we've already done this, let's put ourselves through. But I think it also sends this message that even if you didn't go through war, if you were willing to help, like if you're willing to volunteer, that help should not be denied. Like, I think that's along with the message of this scene. But there's a difference of you're conscripted and forced to do so versus even if you've never experienced war, you're still volunteering. You're saying, I want to do this. The importance is the choice.
I mean, he's a smaller side character, but he gets a really deep storyline with a lot of themes going on, which is great.
Exactly. And what's also funny about this is there's an earlier scene where they actually discuss this. They're like, hey, if we need to, can we just pull Godzilla up with the destroyers? And the scientist is like, no, the destroyers alone don't have enough capabilities to do that. The ships don't have enough to do that. And what's funny is the person who proposes the destroyers to pull Godzilla up is the kid.
Okay.
So you have this irony that now, yes, it is true, the 2 destroyers do not have enough left in order to pull Godzilla up, but the tugboats combined with them have enough tension and torque to get it done.
Yeah, very well done. Very cool. So they do bring him up, and he is damaged still, right?
Big time. Little important context. Right when they are sinking him, he's charging up his death ray.
Okay, yeah.
He charges up his death ray, and then they sink him. And then because he's so heavily damaged, he basically dissipates the energy from the death ray. Like, he gives up on it. So when he comes back up, like, he's hurting. You can see the scars. You can see all this. Like, he's trying to regenerate, but you can see he's really hurting. And he's pissed. Like, he's super pissed at this point. So he immediately starts charging his death ray again.
Yeah.
He immediately starts going. And as he is charging it, this is when the main protagonist, like, this is the moment. Plan A and B have failed. Godzilla's here. He's about to do the death ray, and he's going to kill everyone. So he's like, this is my time. But it's beautiful right before he gets involved is that as Godzilla's charging the death ray, they have a couple scenes in complete silence where you're just seeing all the other people involved in the operation, all the ships, like realize they're about to die. Like Godzilla's about to murder them all. And it's so beautiful. It's completely silent. There's no sound. And you just see the shock in their faces. And the sound comes back when the main protagonist flies in with the plane. Now, I'll point out, some people criticize the scenes. They're like, it takes Godzilla so much time to charge up his death ray in this scene compared to earlier in the film. And I'm like, yes, it does. But I would argue that's because he's severely damaged.
Yeah.
Like, of course, it's going to take him longer because probably the mechanisms, the physiologic mechanisms that allow him to charge the death ray have also been heavily damaged since he's been really hurt. So it's like, yes, this isn't one of those cliche, like, oh, you know, it in the nick of time, it takes him longer than normal to charge his death ray. Like, no, he has good reason within the plot to take longer. So yeah, he's charging up his death ray, and then the main protagonist comes in and bam, just slams the the plane right into his mouth, and then blows it up and literally blows his head off.
Yeah,
decapitates him.
Yeah.
And you know, there's this brief moment of you're like, oh my God, he's dead. And then one of the people on the ship is like, oh look, you know, he ejected. There's a parachute. And you see the relief on everyone's face, like, oh my God, he's alive. You know, he didn't have to sacrifice himself. And then they watch Godzilla, because he was charging up his death ray, and now he got decapitated. All that energy from the death ray is now disintegrating him because he can't release it.
Wow. Thank you for explaining that. This is why you're here.
Which is why I'm here. Yeah, ironically, this is not the first time this has been done. This has actually been used against Godzilla before. His inability to release his death ray, damaging him, has been used before. So this is not the first time Godzilla has died this way.
Cool. Interesting. Because, yeah, I was wondering, you know, you're answering, I was like, oh, that's cool. What's happening there, buddy? I saw his head blow up and I saw the energy kind of, but yeah, explaining it that way, yeah, that makes sense. Like he's built up this energy. He's always had the energy in him, I think, but he's converting the energy into like a heat. He's changing its form. Okay, now he's got this heat energy. Now he has to get rid of it. It's got to go somewhere. And usually he just directs it at something away from him, and it still damages him, but most of it is gone. But what if his head is missing? What happens to the energy then? Well, it hurts his body. That's what's happening there.
Exactly. And he literally disintegrates in front of them. And then there's an interesting scene when, as he's dying, like as his body's disintegrating, all the Japanese people involved in the operation salute him.
Yeah.
They give him the old military salute, and you're like, you know, what's going on here? You know, why is this happening? You know, I think this harkens back to some other Godzilla movies as well, but I think what it comes down to is that they respect their enemy, basically. And a big part, again, about this movie is they've harked a lot about life. You know, taking life is precious. You know, life has value. So I think this is a final salute to say, yes, we needed to beat you, Godzilla. You know, you were a threat to us, but we still respect you as a living creature at the end of the day. You know, we don't view you as this enemy that is worthless, that has no value of life. I believe that's what they meant with that.
Cool. Thank you for explaining that too. That's another thing I was like, okay, cool. What's going on?
Yeah. The value of life, even in the enemy, you know, which is something that in war gets lost, right? Like, it's a lot harder to fight an enemy if you think that they could be a good father or mother or a good contributor to society. It's a lot easier to kill an enemy that you don't personalize or you don't value. And that was a big thing in World War II on all sides, is that all governments in World War II try to convince their citizenship that the enemy was to be dehumanized. Yeah, that the enemy, the Japanese, the Americans, the Germans, every major power in World War II made whoever their enemy was be less than human. They dehumanized them. Because it's easier for us to kill someone if we feel like they have no value.
Sure.
Yeah. And that's the prevailing message of this movie, is like, no, life does have value. And just because you have to defeat something, in this case Godzilla, doesn't mean that his life does not have value.
Absolutely. That's good. Okay, very deep. I think after that, we get a really big emotional reveal, big twist, right?
Yep.
We see earlier that the auntie who was left with a child, who was given the money to take care of her, she receives a telegram.
Yep.
A message, and then she reads the telegram, and she's shocked by what the telegram says. We don't know what it says, although some of us suspect what it might say.
Yep.
So we get to reveal then that what the telegram said was that the female protagonist, the romantic interest, is alive.
Yep.
She survived the attack. Yeah.
Exactly. So then they rush to the hospital. The male protagonist and the daughter Akiko, they rush to the hospital and they meet the female protagonist. Now, our point something out here is I think a lot of people will be like, how on earth could she have survived this? And look no further than Hiroshima and Nagasaki. While hundreds of thousands of people died instantly when those bombs were dropped, there were still countless people who survived the bombings, even if they were outside, because it's not just absolute destruction. We saw it in the World Trade Center towers too. Like, there are people who, very few, but there were people who were able to survive in the rubble, survive in that destruction. And that's just because it's not complete utter destruction. There can be pockets of shelter that are created because of how structures are or how the blast was dissipated through surrounding areas. So to be like, oh, she couldn't have survived it, there are people who survived those bombings. Not to say that it was a pleasant experience in survival either. But yes, it is possible for her to survive as people survived Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Right.
The other thing I point out, which she says to him when he shows up, is your war over? And that is a reference to a scene we talked about before where he's struggling with his PTSD. And he basically tells her, he's like, the war is not over for me. And what he means with that is like, yes, World War II is over, but his struggle with the war is not over. So she is hopeful that now that Godzilla is gone and all this has moved forward, that he has finally overcome that. That's what she's referencing.
And I will also say, I got to talk about the child. All the children in this movie. I think there's at least 2 children that play the same little girl at different ages. Great child actors. I mean, they're very believable. I mean, sometimes it's hard to get a little kid, like a toddler. It's really hard. But during that final scene, there's this one moment where like the father's like crying. Once again, doing that great male crying that I love acting, that I think, like I said, I think a lot of men will relate to this character. They're like, man, look at this guy being emotional. I'm emotional like that too. Maybe, I don't act that way all the time, but inside I'm like that. But anyway, during that scene where he's meeting, he finds out that his love interest is a female protagonist, it's a woman that he loves, not just romantically, but just loves her in general, is alive. He's crying. And I remember the girl is in his arms, a little toddler, and she's just like looking at his face, like with like confusement or befuddlement. But I think that's true. I mean, that's probably what would really happen. She's just a little toddler. How can she comprehend that, with everything that's going on in the adult's world? And so I thought that was a well done scene.
Absolutely. I think her face shows empathy, right? So it's a very human quality of like, you may walk up and see a stranger crying on the street. You don't know who they are or what they're crying about, but the empathetic part of you feels sad for them. You feel their sadness. I feel like that's what she was expressing there. And honestly, I don't know if that was acting on her part, or because children are generally very good at that. Like, they don't understand why someone feels an emotion, but they can still empathize with the emotion. Mm-hmm. So that's what I'm very curious about, is what were her expressions that she was acting to do that, or is she just naturally being a child reacting to an adult expressing grief? I don't know. But that's the beauty of the scene, is that it's so good that you don't know. You don't know if that's just her legitimate childlike nature or if she's actually acting that out.
Right. And like I said, it's just a small detail, but it makes the world of difference. How could it have gone the other way? Okay, the other way is this kid's distracted. It's looking into the corner. It's fidgeting with something in its hands. That's how it could have gone another way, and it might have gone in a different movie. And so I don't know. I liked it. I noticed it. It was good.
Exactly. And then we get to the two surprises at the end of the movie. So the first surprise is male character bonding again with the female protagonist, and the camera is panning on the female protagonist, and it basically pans to her back. And on her back, you can see this kind of black thing showing up right above her shirt line. It's very brief. It's only there for a few seconds, but you can see there's something abnormal on her back. And they never come out and say what that is, because then the movie cuts to the second surprise. What I personally believe that is a sign of radiation poisoning. Now, I've heard some other people online be like, is it a virus? Like, did she pick up some disease? I'm like, well, it could be. It could be that. But radiation poisoning from Godzilla is something that is very prevalent in other movies. It was very prevalent in the first Godzilla, the original Godzilla movie, which there's a very iconic scene, which I think this is referencing in the first Godzilla movie, where after Godzilla's final attack on Tokyo before he dies in the first Godzilla movie, there's a scene where they have this little girl who's presumably orphaned standing next to a doctor, and the doctor has a Geiger counter, which measures radiation. And he has the Geiger counter up to her, and you can see the meter on the Geiger counter is like off the charts. And this girl is probably the same age as Akiko in the film, like maybe 2 or 3. And it's a very poignant scene because there's no dialogue during that scene in the original movie, but it's poignant because you're like, this girl's going to die. She's going to die of radiation poisoning. And you don't need to know Japanese culture or language to get that. And I feel like that's what was being portrayed here. Like, she survived, but like many who survived Hiroshima and Nagasaki, she may not survive for very long.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Crazy, man. That's crazy. Okay. I don't know. I almost want to say that's a secret ending, hidden meaning, because I didn't notice that. And I think a lot of people won't.
It's a very subtle detail. It's very quick. Yeah.
Well, I love it though. That changes the ending, makes it better, stronger, but also gives me a touch of the melancholy. You know what I mean?
It does. Yeah. And that's the point of the movie, is that it's meant to be like, yes, there's a triumphant moment, but there is still loss, right? There is still this loss going on. The other thing I wanted to point out is a lot of people might say like, oh, wasn't it convenient that, like now after, so many days or potentially weeks after Godzilla attacks Ginza, that now they send a telegram. And now, she shows up at the end to be with the male protagonist. I'm like, yeah, I mean, this is 1946, people. Like, not everyone has telephones. Not everyone has televisions. These are still rare commodities, especially in post-war Japan that's rebuilding. There's millions of people missing, which they emphasize when he tries to look for the mechanic. So, and for all we know, she could have been in a coma for weeks, after that Godzilla attack. So it's very viable in that time period that it would take that long for her to be able to reach out and them to reconnect.
And it's still a happy ending because he gets a reunion with her, and he gets to say goodbye. I mean, eventually these characters are going to die at some point, who knows when, but he gets a chance of saying goodbye, whatever that may be.
Exactly. Before we get to the final surprise, I'm going to point out that this ending of how they deal with Godzilla and the fact that the main protagonist lives is a direct message and mirroring of what happens in the original Godzilla film, Gojira. So for those who don't know, in the original Godzilla film, the Japanese military throws everything they have at Godzilla and nothing works. Like, Godzilla just shrugs it off like a boss and is just like, you are nothing to me. You're not going to stop me. But a scientist character, Dr. Serizawa, creates something called the oxygen destroyer, basically something that pulls oxygen out of the water, which, as strong as Godzilla is, he needs oxygen in order to regenerate and live.
he's maybe a little cryptozoological, hidden animal-like, but he's not paranormal. That's interesting because he needs energy. He needs food. He needs an energy source. I don't know. Maybe he gets it from the sun or from thermal vents, but he needs energy and he needs oxygen, and he's just an incredible animal, but he's still, So that's why the oxygen destroyer works. That's a lot of the solutions work because at the end of the day, he's just a big animal.
He is.
The problem is he's so big and he regenerates, but he's still an animal. I guess we could do the quote, if it bleeds, we can kill it.
Exactly. It's true. Yeah. It's just a matter of how. Now, Dr. Serizawa, he stumbles upon the oxygen destroyer accidentally, not planning that Godzilla is going to happen or any of that, but he recognizes the destructive power of the oxygen destroyer, that this could be used as a huge weapon. Like, sure, it could kill Godzilla, but it also kill a lot of people in the end. So he's very torn about the destruction that Godzilla is raining down on Tokyo and the use of the oxygen destroyer. And what convinces him to finally use it is when the Japanese military exhausts everything and Godzilla just lays waste to a huge part of Tokyo. He's like, okay, this is it. Like, this is the last chance we have to get rid of Godzilla. But he's still very worried about the oxygen destroyer being misused. So as soon as he agrees to do it, he burns the plans of the oxygen destroyer so that others cannot follow in his footsteps. And then as a final measure, when he deploys the oxygen destroyer and Godzilla dies, he cuts his oxygen line because he's underwater when he's deploying the oxygen destroyer to kill himself, so that the secrets of the oxygen destroyer die with him. So this is very poignant to that movie because that's actually a surprise for that movie because you don't know he's going to kill himself. So he could have lived, but he chooses to die in order to bury the secrets of the oxygen destroyer, which is in contrast to this movie where the main protagonist, we think he's going to die, but he chooses to live instead. And I don't think that's a contrast of saying, oh, Serizawa is better or this guy is better. I think it's, again, how are we valuing life? The original Godzilla movie was about a lot of death. And this movie is also about a lot of death. But the difference is this movie's overwhelming theme is we need to value life in the end. And obviously, this main character did not have the secret of the oxygen destroyer with him. So it made sense that Serizawa had to sacrifice himself. But I don't think that was done by mistake. I don't think it was by mistake that people didn't think Serizawa was going to die, and he did. And that's what I mentioned about the plot armor. Like, in the very first Godzilla movie, one of the main characters dies in a very dramatic fashion. Whereas in this movie, that main character lives. But they both do it to send a message. One is sending a message to say these type of weapons should never be used again, and we should stop at all costs from having them being produced. Whereas this main character's main message is that we must live on. Like, despite our horrors, despite what we've experienced in war, we must live on for a better future, and we must value life and value the life that we have. And both of those are important messages for their time. It was important in 1954 to say the ends don't justify the means. Because Godzilla was born of atomic weapons, we should not use something worse than atomic weapons, the oxygen destroyer, to overcome him. And in our modern times, we need to value life, especially in times of war. Like, again, what happens in Ukraine, what happens in Israel and Palestine right now. Like, we need to be valuing life and trying to preserve life as best as possible. And would you like to go over the second secret ending?
Let me tell you what I see, because it's actually, I don't know a lot. Let me just tell you what I saw, what I think, which honestly, probably a lot of people are going to maybe have similar feelings to me. So you could clarify some things. Okay. I see a mass in the water of what I presume is Godzilla or what's left of Godzilla. I see some puffing going on.
Yep.
Some puffing up. This mass is like, if you were just to show me this mass, I wouldn't know it's Godzilla. Yeah. Maybe my vision's bad, but I know it is Godzilla because what else would it be?
Yep. And they play Godzilla's theme. Yeah, okay, the music's going too, yeah.
And yeah, I just see some movement. And what I think is Godzilla's not dead. Godzilla's going to be back. I'm missing a lot of context. Why don't you fill in some of those blanks? What's going on there?
Yeah. So basically what is left of him is regenerating. Like he's coming back. Again, to give context of the movies, he's come back from worse, folks. He's come back from worse. So I mentioned that there was another movie where his death ray was used against him. So there was a movie called Godzilla, Mothra, King Ghidorah, All Monsters Attack. And he's killed in a very similar way. But in that movie, he swallows a submarine that has a drill on it. And as he's about to use the death ray, the submarine drills out of him. So the death ray comes out of him and disintegrates him. So that's how he died in that movie. But in that movie, it has, ironically, a very similar surprise ending where only his heart is left. It is literally just his heart is at the bottom of Tokyo Bay, and it starts beating and it starts regenerating.
Wow.
So there was even less of him in that movie than in this movie, but he came back. So yeah, he's coming back, folks. And that's where I do believe this may be the start of a new cinematic universe, which let me tell you, this is a hell of a way to start it.
That's kind of cool. That kind of makes sense, the regenerative thing. I mean, because every cell in our body has, wait, maybe I'm wrong, but doesn't every cell have a copy of all our DNA in it?
Yes, it does.
Okay. I'm no geneticist, but okay. So yeah, it makes sense with his regenerative properties that even if you just had heart tissue or skin tissue, you have the information there to make the rest of Godzilla. I'll put it that way.
It's all there. Yeah.
It's all there. So, closing thoughts on Godzilla -1. I think who's ever listening to this, you should watch the movie. It is a very good movie. Your mom will like this movie. If you don't think you would like a Godzilla movie, but you like learning about history, you like human drama, good acting, you're going to like Godzilla -1. It's got very broad appeal. All the technical aspects are perfect. Your cinematography, your special effects, your sound, your music, your acting, your costumes, your sets, your lighting, everything. It's got no fat on it. I was never bored. I never checked my clock. I was on the edge of a seat. I'm glad it's doing well. There's a lot of people in theaters enjoying it. There's a lot to dig deep into the movie because of the history, because of Japanese culture. I mean, it's really human history at this point. The themes that are discussed in Godzilla, it affects everybody. Obviously, it all starts with World War II. That's kind of the genesis of this movie in a lot of ways. That war started the Godzilla franchise, which is 70 years old now. Another thing I just want to mention, my last things I want to say is, it's a great movie. There's lessons here that we touched on of why it's a great movie. It's not because the budget's big. It's not the budget. It's because the people who made the movie really liked the movie. They had passionate ideas about the movie. The actors wanted to be there. Everybody was on board because it was a good idea. And as you said, I think, they took their time with the special effects. They didn't rush the special effects. And I think that's what makes it a good movie. It's a great movie. And I just think there's a lesson there for all these other movies. We talked about DC and Marvel movies and just movies that flop. They're being rushed out. It's like as a product. There's no real passion there. And, what I like the most about movies is going to the theater and forgetting I'm watching a movie and I'm actually having an adventure. I think you can't be a cynic for that to happen. At least I don't think so. I think it helps not to be a cynic. When I go into a movie, I try to leave all my cynicism at the door. So I'm open-minded and I want to forget stuff. I want to be transported away. And I think that's what a really good movie does, whether it's a Marvel movie, DC movie, or a Godzilla movie like this. And I think that's a goal for a lot of movies. I think the goal for a lot of movies is just to kind of forget you're watching a movie and just be engrossed in it. And like I said, Godzilla -1 does that. And I think it does it because people focus on the right things. It's not the budget, it's not the speed of producing it, it's not how much money they're going to make. It's because everybody has a good story to tell. And those are my thoughts.
I agree with all those points. Folks, if you've never seen Godzilla, Go watch this movie because you're going to see him at his best. You're going to see the best qualities of why this is a 70-year-old franchise. You won't have to watch the other 36 movies total or the other 32 Toho movies to get it. Just watch this movie and you will understand. And I'll emphasize again something we mentioned earlier, which is we talked a lot about the details of this movie and the spoilers. And the majority of what we talked about was not Godzilla. It was the human. It was the human scenes. And that is what makes this movie different. If you watch this movie and then you go watch Kong versus Godzilla, you will see the world of difference of what makes a masterpiece Godzilla movie. And it's not the $200 million plus budget. It isn't, folks. The other thing I will say is watch it on the biggest screen possible. If you can watch it in IMAX, there is a difference. Like Godzilla's roar hits differently. That atomic breath hits differently when you watch it on the big screen, when you watch it with a really good sound system. It just feels very different. And the last thing I will mention, again, especially for people who are not used to Godzilla, you need to go see this movie soon because traditionally Japanese Godzilla movies don't stay in theaters for very long. Like, I would not expect this movie to still be in theaters in January. If it is, that's because it's doing really well because people went and saw it. Shin Godzilla, when it came out in 2016, the last time we had a Toho Godzilla movie, it was out in less than a month. So go see it now, folks. See it while you can, enjoy it while you can, and be thankful that we are in an era where we can watch a movie like this and enjoy its beauty. The last thing I will say is for families out there, this is rated PG-13. It is a little scary. So you should definitely think of your kids who are under 13, whether they're ready for this film. But what I will say is this film is a great way if you have struggled to talk to your younger kids about modern war in the sense of what's happened in Ukraine, what's happened in Israel and Palestine. This movie will give you an opportunity to do so because this movie is all about war, but it portrays it in such a way that you can talk about it in a modern context and spark that conversation and teach your kids or just teach yourself. And again, that's the best part of Godzilla is that Godzilla is here to really put a mirror back on ourselves and teach us about ourselves and how we can be better. And that is it for me.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on, sharing your opinions with a lot of people that are going to listen to this. I know we would have talked about it anyway. I think a lot of people are going to learn a lot about this movie. Yeah, everybody please subscribe, just like. If you leave any comments, I'll respond to all the comments. If you have a question for me, let me know. If you have a question for the doctor, Dr. John Blaylock, I'll pass it on to him. I'll get you an answer. Thank you, everybody, for listening. I really appreciate it. And good night, everybody.
Good night, folks.